On the 13th of April 1943, German troops deep in Soviet territory make a grisly discovery. In Katyn forest, near Smolensk in western Russia, they stumble upon a series of mass graves containing more than 4,000 bodies, all officers from the Polish military, including an admiral, generals, and majors. For Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, news of the mass graves is a desperately needed opportunity. It is clear the graves have been there for several years. So Goebbels and the German High Command know that these Polish prisoners must have been killed by the Soviets soon after they invaded Poland in 1939. Goebbels believes he can use this information to turn Churchill and Roosevelt against Stalin and weaken their alliance. But despite Goebbels' attempts to publicize the massacre and turn international opinion against the Soviets, he's no match for Stalin's duplicity. When questioned by his allies, the Soviet leader denies all knowledge of the massacre and pins the blame firmly on the Nazi regime. And Churchill and Roosevelt accept his assurances. They're about to enter the critical phase of the war, and they need Stalin and his Red Army as much as he needs them. In 1942, the Soviet Union, the United States and Great Britain, whilst theoretically united against the fascist Axis powers, were in practice nations apart. Stalin's Soviet forces were isolated and suffering, desperately defending their Western territories from the Nazi invaders. The Americans were still in shock after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and as newcomers to this war, were still finding their feet. And Churchill, despite pleas from Stalin and Roosevelt, was still determined to postpone the invasion of northern France until he could be absolutely sure of victory. In August 1942, Churchill flew to Moscow to meet with Stalin. It was supposed to be a meeting of all three of the major Allied powers, but Roosevelt was unable to attend because of his health.
What's remarkable, and we know this now because of the recently published Ivan Maitsky's diaries, that Churchill was talking about an alliance with the Soviet Union much earlier than people had previously thought. So Churchill was willing to be flexible in the tradition of geostrategic politics, global politics, and even if that meant working with someone who you didn't necessarily like very well, he understood that ultimately a Nazi Germany represented a greater threat than the Soviet Russia.
The Soviet Union was on its knees, and Stalin was desperate for Churchill and the Western Allies to open up a Western front in Europe and to ease the vast pressure on his armies in the East.
Stalin's demand for a second front speaks to some of the real tensions among the big three about their own national interests and also their visions of what the war was for.
For him as well, this was about his prestige in the big three. And so he wanted to be treated as an equal in this common struggle against Hitler, and he was very frustrated by the fact that Churchill would not agree to open that second front sooner than later.
Churchill was well aware of this and arrived in Moscow for a series of meetings, still determined not to give in to Stalin.
His principal goal is to talk to Stalin directly because he's concerned that Roosevelt has made a rather rash promise to embark on a second front in France in 1942. Now, of course, that message could have been sent by telegram, but Churchill also wants to open up some kind of a personal connection to Joseph Stalin. He's a little concerned that Roosevelt earlier in the year has said that Stalin likes Roosevelt better than he likes Churchill, and so perhaps Roosevelt should speak for the both of them. Churchill did not like that.
After the usual pleasantries, Churchill cut to the chase, saying both British and American military advisors had warned against a cross-channel invasion of France as being too risky that year.
As far as Stalin is concerned, his prime hope is that Churchill has come to offer a second front, though he knows from his ambassador in London that actually Churchill is going to try and get out of it. And following his ambassador's advice, he attempts to shame Churchill by presenting the idea that the British are scared to fight, trying to appeal to Churchill's fighting spirit. And he does that, and Churchill is very offended.
Churchill's response was to unfurl a map of the Mediterranean and North Africa. He then took a pen and started to draw a crocodile with a dangerous snout.
Churchill draws his picture of a crocodile and says you can attack a crocodile by hitting it on the snout or hitting it on the soft underbelly. And the Mediterranean is the soft underbelly, and Stalin says, yes, I can see the advantages of doing that.
But did Churchill really believe this was the best way to defeat Nazi Germany?
I think Winston Churchill was convinced of the idea that you could move into Germany or move into Europe by pushing up through the Eastern Mediterranean. Churchill loves this idea. In fact, Churchill's only novel, Savrola, is about someone who does exactly that and leads an expedition through the soft underbelly of Europe.
But many historians today think Churchill was also motivated by his desire to keep the British Empire alive.
Churchill is particularly concerned that the Mediterranean remain under British control, because it's the connection point with the Suez Canal at one end and Gibraltar at the other of the British Empire, and particularly, of course, the important part of the British Empire, which is the trade.
Stalin initially appeared convinced and seemed to back Churchill's plans. However, when they met the next day, Stalin's mood had changed.
At their second meeting, Stalin decides, well, I'm not going to let him get away with that, and starts having a go at Churchill and lecturing him that the Germans aren't that difficult to fight if you start getting down to it. It looks like the meeting's going to completely collapse. And when Churchill goes for his final meeting with Stalin, it's supposed to be just saying goodbye. They haven't agreed anything, but they've kind of agreed to differ. After they've chatted for a bit, Stalin says to Churchill, would you like to come back to my flat for a drink? So back they go to Stalin's little apartment in the Kremlin, which was formerly Catherine the Great's bedroom, and they sit down and start chatting and drinking. And they're there for 5 hours. And they sit there talking about military affairs that they both love. They're both commanders-in-chief. They both always stay up all the night talking. Stalin's daughter comes in and brings them some food, and Churchill says, oh, I've got a red-headed daughter as well. So they start talking about their children and things. And after the end of 5 hours, they leave having formed a very strange personal relationship.
Despite Stalin's appeals for a more direct approach to ease the pressure on his troops, the soft underbelly of Churchill's crocodile, the Mediterranean, was to be the focus for the next critical phase of the war. But if Churchill had looked 400 miles northeast to the besieged city of Leningrad, might he have been more susceptible to Stalin's entreaties? As Churchill and Stalin sat in Moscow discussing the Allies' best route to victory, the Soviet Union's second city, Leningrad, was under siege by the German Sixth Army. The Nazi blockade would eventually last nearly 900 days and claim the lives of more than 800,000 civilians, as well as more than 1 million Soviet and German soldiers. The Siege of Leningrad had begun in August 1941, just over 2 months after the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the sudden invasion of the Soviet Union by 3 million Nazi troops. Hitler considered Leningrad to be a key strategic target. It was home to the Soviets' Baltic Fleet, and second only to Moscow in terms of industrial output. But with his invasion force spread wide across the Western Soviet Union, the Nazi dictator did not have the strength in manpower or equipment to overrun Leningrad, so he ordered his troops to encircle the historic city. He did not want to capture Leningrad, but to destroy it by shelling and bombing and starving its people to death. By October 1941, Leningrad was almost completely surrounded, with road and rail links cut off. The population suffered constant shelling, and an estimated 75,000 bombs were dropped during the 900-day siege. Meanwhile, the city's 3 million inhabitants were slowly starving. The only supply route was across Lake Ladoga. Provisions had to be brought by boat or across the ice during the frozen winters.
very hard to get food in and out. Ironically, when the deep freeze came on, and it was possible to drive over the lakes, then it was almost easier than when the ground was muddy or there was heavy rain. So the city had to be supplied basically by convoys of lorries across the lakes, under shell fire the whole time, and it's just horrendous.
Strict rationing was brought in by the authorities in an attempt to conserve the very limited supplies. Diaries from survivors of the siege reflect the terrible effects of the shortages. There is no worse feeling than when all your thoughts are on food, wrote Berta Zlotnikova, a teenager. I am becoming an animal. Another anonymous man wrote, my stomach has caved in. My ribs stick out from top to bottom. Ration cards became the only useful currency in the city, with people stealing them and even killing for them.
Food quickly ran out. There was no electricity. Communications were severed. People of Leningrad were soon forced to start eating cats, mice, dogs, leather, whatever they could find to sustain themselves. There were cases of cannibalism, which were suppressed by Soviet authorities, but it's a sign of the desperation which spread through the city.
Despite these daily horrors, the people of Leningrad held out. But it would be 2 long years of death and disease before the Red Army finally managed to lift the siege. While the Soviet armies struggled to fight off the Nazi forces in the frozen east, their Western allies were engaging the Axis powers in the deserts of Africa. The North African campaign began in June 1940 and continued for 3 years. The British forces, which included troops from Australia, New Zealand, India and South Africa, were encamped in Egypt, while the Italian and German Axis forces were in control of Tunisia and Libya. North Africa wasn't only important in terms of attacking Germany via the soft underbelly of Europe, it was also vital for keeping access open to the Suez Canal and oil in the Middle East.
Britain was not prepared to let the Suez Canal fall into enemy hands, because that would have closed off any possibility of using the Mediterranean as a shipping route again. If Britain controlled the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean, so if she had defeated Italy, then the route to the Far East, to India in particular, was much shorter and would free up a lot of shipping.
During the first 18 months of the North Africa campaign, each army had struggled to maintain its position across the expanse of the Sahara Desert. With huge distances to cover over isolated areas, successful offensives often ground to a halt as supplies ran out and troops were forced to retreat to safer positions.
Primarily, it is a war of logistics and supply, and the rhythm of the campaign is entirely determined by the capability of each side to supply themselves, both at either end of a very long, thousands of miles long supply chain. When the Allies get too far to the west, they're too far away from their sources of supply, which are primarily in Egypt. Their ability to maintain themselves and to keep moving forwards is eroding day by day, every mile west that they go. Likewise, the Germans, whose supply lines are stretched back to the western end, to Tunisia and the western end of Libya, when they go too far east, their fighting effort is prejudiced.
Defending the Allies' position was the British 8th Army, led by one of World War II's most notorious military commanders, General Bernard Law Montgomery. A graduate of Sandhurst, Montgomery was shot through the lung by a sniper during the First World War and was so severely injured that a grave was prepared for him. However, he went on to make a full recovery and spent the rest of the war as a staff officer, where he could observe tactics used by the military high command and became an outspoken critic of their willingness to accept large numbers of casualties to gain a tactical advantage. In 1942, Churchill appointed Montgomery commander of the 8th Army in North Africa, entrusting him with leading the fight against German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox.
Montgomery, I think, was clear in his own mind and certainly put it to his army. There is no going back. We are not going back any further. We will stay here, we will prepare, and to be fair, he was true to his word. very methodical, some would say cautious, unwilling to unnecessarily risk soldiers' lives.
He was a very skilled general. He understood his intelligence. He was getting a lot of intelligence from Bletchley Park about the weaknesses of the German army, and he knew how to exploit that.
El Alamein was seen as the gateway to Egypt and the Suez Canal beyond. At 10 p.m. on the night of October the 23rd, 1942, the British 8th Army launched their offensive on the Axis forces with a furious 15-minute bombardment by more than 1,000 guns. Crucially, at this point, Rommel was not with his troops, as he was at home in Germany on sick leave. By the time he returned to command 3 days later, German lines had been broken, and the Allies were in total control. Hitler ordered his troops to fight and die to the last man. But after 12 days of exhausting combat in El Alamein, Rommel and his remaining men retreated across the desert back to Tunisia. Montgomery's 8th Army had lost nearly 5,000 men, but Rommel's army lost more. 9,000 Axis soldiers were killed, and a further 35,000 were taken prisoner. It had been an overwhelming victory for General Montgomery and the 8th Army, but the Battle of El Alamein was also symbolically and psychologically significant. This was the first time in the war the Western Allies had broken a German army on the ground and delivered a knockout blow, sending them into full retreat.
Churchill makes the famous quote about this not being the beginning of the end, this is the end of the beginning.
In his post-war memoirs, Churchill wrote, "It might almost be said that before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." In another 6 months, the Allies would drive the Axis forces out of North Africa completely. As Rommel and his men retreated into Tunisia, the Allies were planning a further, and they hoped final, operation to remove the Axis troops from North Africa. Operation Torch, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower and launched on the 8th of November 1942, saw a vast amphibious landing at Fadala in Morocco, 15 miles northeast of Casablanca. Hitler was still keen to defend North Africa at all costs and sent reinforcements from Germany. However, they were vastly outnumbered by the Allied troops, made up of British, American, Canadian, French, and Indian soldiers. The Axis forces were trapped in Tunisia and surrounded by the Allied armies. In addition, the British Navy controlled the Mediterranean Sea to the north, and the RAF was in charge of the skies. The Germans had nowhere to go, but they weren't giving up. Arriving on the Moroccan shore at Fadala, the American forces met little resistance, but that would quickly change. On the 19th of February 1943, Rommel ordered an assault on the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, which was held by the US Second Corps. The Germans inflicted heavy damage on the defending Americans, and the Allies suffered around 10,000 casualties, with hundreds of American troops taken prisoner.
American troops badly mauled at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, forced to retreat, and the American High Command realizes that its troops need to be far better trained and, equally important, far better led than they were at Kasserine Pass.
Eisenhower replaced the lieutenant general in charge with a more aggressive commander, who would come to be recognized as one of America's greatest ever generals and battlefield tacticians, General George S. Patton. Under Patton's relentless command, the superior numbers of the Allies won out as they drove the Axis forces back into a smaller and smaller area.
Remember this, you don't have to be a corpse to be a hero.
On the 13th of May 1943, surrounded by the Allied armies, the Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered, and more than 250,000 of their soldiers were captured. The Allies had taken North Africa and now had a base from which to build the next phase of their strategy to attack Germany via Sicily. Here, General Patton would come into conflict, not only with the Axis forces, but also his supposed ally, Field Marshal Montgomery. The two men loathed one another almost more than their enemy, with each determined to outshine the other. As the strike through the Mediterranean got underway in earnest, America and Roosevelt were also focused on becoming the dominant power in the Pacific, and that would mean taking on the imperial forces of Japan. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had left the US armies shocked and humiliated. But 6 months later, a reinvigorated US military took part in a huge naval and aerial battle which would go on to define the war in the Pacific, the Battle of Midway. For the Japanese, the success of Pearl Harbor left them determined to eliminate any American military presence in the Pacific. The first step would be to attack and take control of the small island of Midway, the westernmost US-held territory in the Pacific. This island, more than 3,000 miles west of the USA and 2,500 miles from Japan, was home to a US naval base and was seen by Japanese command as the gateway to domination of the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese approached the battle with a clear advantage in firepower. But the US had a different strength: intelligence. American code-breaking teams based in Hawaii had intercepted Japanese communications about their secret plans. The Japanese intended to fake an attack on the Aleutian Islands north of Midway, diverting the American fleet away from their real target. In addition, US codebreakers had discovered the time, location, and the plan of attack on Midway. As they approached Midway on the 4th of June 1942, the Japanese were expecting to carry out a surprise attack on the US, just as they had at Pearl Harbor. This time, the tables had been turned. American planes bombed the Japanese carriers, which still had dozens of aircraft on deck being refueled. The Japanese lost 3 carriers almost immediately.
So at the time, Pearl Harbor was thought of as a disaster for the Americans and a huge success for the Japanese because they had sunk all the American battleships. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see that things were a little bit different than that. The American aircraft carriers survived, and over the rest of the war, the Americans evolved a way of waging war involving aircraft carriers and amphibious infantry. That allowed them to leapfrog from island to island across the Pacific until they got within range of Japan, and thereby created a whole new way of war built around the aircraft carrier rather than around the battleship, which is still broadly the way that navies operate today.
The battle continued for 3 days, and while the Japanese rallied, they never regained the initiative. The Battle of Midway ended in a resounding US victory. The Japanese lost more than 3,000 men, 4 carriers, and hundreds of aircraft at Midway, while the United States lost just 362 men, 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 144 aircraft. The Battle of Midway turned the war in the Pacific on its head. The Japanese imperial expansion had been stopped, and now the Americans would push them back, island by island. With its navy once more in command of the seas, the US forces planned to seize control of the many Pacific islands. And one of the most brutal battles of the campaign took place at Guadalcanal. This British colony, one of the Solomon Islands, had been invaded by Japanese troops in July 1942. But the Allies wanted to reclaim it, and on the 7th of August, their first major land offensive in the Pacific began. 6,000 US Marines landed on Guadalcanal and seized the airfield, surprising the 2,000 Japanese soldiers there. With both the US and Japanese seeing Guadalcanal as strategically important, a ferocious fight for control of this territory began. Both sides poured reinforcements onto the island. By October, the Japanese had around 36,000 ground and naval troops there. The savage combat went on for months in the island jungle. In a bid to regain control of the island's airstrip, the Japanese sent 7,000 troops on 11 transport ships, protected by 2 battleships. The Allies had received intelligence reports that the convoy was coming and sent every available unit in the area to attack the Japanese fleet. After an intense battle, most of the Japanese ships were sunk. Finally, in February 1943, the Japanese, completely overwhelmed, were forced to evacuate 12,000 of their remaining troops from Guadalcanal. From then on, the Japanese were only able to send supplies and reinforcements by submarine, and as their numbers and morale dwindled, the Allied forces gradually took control. Japan could only go on the defensive against an increasingly powerful United States.
No Jap planes attack this beachhead. American air power rules the Solomon. And 1943, the year of strength, has just begun. The leaders have planned. The United Nations are sworn to attack until there is peace with the unconditional surrender of the Axis.
In January 1943, with war raging in the Pacific, North Africa, and Russia, Churchill and Roosevelt met in Casablanca to decide upon future plans for the war.
The Americans come to Casablanca hoping for agreement that the next operation will be the invasion of northern France. The British come hoping that the next operation will be to continue their movements in the Mediterranean. They manage to persuade the Americans to agree that they will at least embark on the next operation, which is the invasion of Sicily. The Americans say that will be it, and then we'll transfer our attentions to northern France. The British, I think, hope that, well, we hope it won't be it. Once we've got Sicily, the obvious thing to do will be to carry on into Italy.
Roosevelt was still keen on an Allied invasion in western France, though less so than Stalin, who had declined the invitation to the conference because of the dire situation the Red Army and his people were facing at Leningrad. So far, Churchill's plan had succeeded. FDR, distracted by events in the Pacific, and without Stalin to back him up, once again allowed the British Prime Minister to have his way, and the Second Front in Europe was again postponed.
I think Roosevelt recognized that the Allies, the Western Allies, were simply not ready yet. For example, they did not have sufficient flat-bottom boats to convey invading troops onto the beaches.
One overarching conclusion that was reached in Casablanca, with which Stalin would certainly have agreed, was that there would be no deals with Hitler. The only goal of this war was total victory and unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. In July 1942, Stalin and the people of the Soviet Union, already suffering aerial bombardment and starvation in Leningrad, were facing a vicious assault from the Nazis in another Soviet city. Situated on the banks of the Volga River in southwestern Russia, Stalingrad was a key strategic target for the Nazis. It was one of the Soviet Union's main producers of tanks, armaments, and tractors, and taking control of it would sever transport links with southern Russia. The Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted 7 months, is regarded as the bloodiest and most brutal battle of the entire Second World War.
I'm not sure any other battle, certainly in Europe, comes close to Stalingrad. It was a big city, Stalingrad. The Volga, huge river flowing through it, very important industrially to the Soviet Union. So totemic, and in strategic terms, basically, It stopped the Russians' ability to cross the river Volga.
As important as the military victory was the potential propaganda victory the Nazis would have by seizing the city bearing the Soviet leader's name.
It had great symbolism in his mind. He was not going to let this fall to the Germans. It was an important supply route on the Volga River, which moved goods from the south of Russia to the north. But Stalingrad was also in Hitler's path as he moved his forces south. So it was absolutely imperative that the city didn't fall to Hitler.
Stalin steadfastly refused to concede to the Germans, and on the 28th of July issued Order Number 227, which decreed that the city's defenders would take not one step back. He also refused to allow the evacuation of any civilians, stating that the army would fight harder to defend the people who lived there. More than 300,000 crack German soldiers were tasked with taking Stalingrad. On the 23rd of August, the Luftwaffe launched a ruthless aerial assault on the city, launching wave after wave of incendiary bombs, which razed most of the city's wooden housing to the ground. By mid-September, the Germans had pushed the Soviet forces back into the very center of the city, a 9-mile-long strip along the Volga. Within weeks, the Nazis controlled 2/3 of Stalingrad, and Hitler broadcast a message that the city was about to fall. But Stalin stuck by his promise to defend it at all costs and sent in more reinforcements. Under the leadership of General Zhukov, one of the few competent Red Army commanders to have avoided Stalin's purges, the Soviets dug in and engaged the enemy in close combat, street by street, house by house, and even floor by floor.
In the city, you can't move great fleets of tanks. It's messy, it's short-range stuff. The techniques are rather different. The ammunition expenditure in build-up areas is vast. They are different beasts.
The Nazi invaders became increasingly tired and dispirited by the heavy losses they had suffered. Conversely, the Red Army was buoyed by successfully holding its ground, and while keeping the Nazis at bay, they planned a counter-offensive of their own outside the city. On the 19th of November 1942, Operation Uranus was launched north and south of the Axis troops, attacking the weaker divisions at the flanks of the German attack, rather than the crack troops on the front line in the city. The operation totally surprised the Nazis, and within 4 days, the German and Axis armies outside Stalingrad were completely surrounded, leaving the divisions in the city cut off. Hitler refused to allow them to retreat from the Volga River and ordered them to stand and fight. But this was a losing battle. Winter was setting in, and food and medical supplies were running out. Eventually, on the 31st of January 1943, the Germans surrendered. Stalin and his Red Army had finally won the Battle of Stalingrad. This was Stalin's greatest victory in the entire war, but it came at great cost. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers are estimated to have been killed, wounded, or captured, and more than 40,000 civilians also died.
The tolerance for casualties of the leaders of the Soviet Union is remarkable. The Russians executed 13,000 of their own men in the course of the Battle of Stalingrad for not fighting hard enough. 13,000. The Russians were willing to send men into action in Stalingrad without weapons. They were expected to, when things were most desperate, they were ferried across the river Volga, dropped on the bank, told to climb up the bank and pick up a rifle as they went, and then go and fight the Germans. There was an acceptance of the requirement to sacrifice for the motherland.
The Axis forces also sustained heavy losses, an estimated 800,000 men.
It was as close to the Germans got to breaking through right into the heartland. And the fact that Nazi Germany was roundly defeated It was very symbolic.
The impact of the victory was immense. Stalingrad was undoubtedly the key turning point in the war between Germany and the Soviet Union, and also in the overall battle between Allied forces and the Axis powers. But just as the tide finally seemed to be turning in favor of the Big Three, the Nazi discovery of thousands of corpses in mass graves in a forest in Western Russia threatened to cause a major rift between the Allies. On the 13th of April 1943, when Nazi soldiers discovered more than 4,000 bodies hidden in mass graves in Katyn Forest in the Soviet Union, all the evidence suggested that the killings had been carried out by the Soviets during their invasion of Poland. The carve-up of the country had been agreed between Hitler and Stalin in the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. The victims, who had been shot in the back of the head and buried, were Polish military officers. And the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels was now keen to publicize the massacre to the world in an attempt to break the alliance between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. But Goebbels was to be disappointed. Whatever Churchill and Roosevelt may have suspected about Stalin's part in these murders, they could not afford to lose him as an ally.
There is very little doubt that both Roosevelt and Churchill knew that the Soviets were responsible for the massacre. But again, it was a trade-off certainly for Roosevelt and even for Churchill. Are we going to kick up a fuss about this?
Churchill is quoted as saying, alas, it's probably true. The Soviets, of course, denied that they'd been responsible and accused the Germans of having killed the Poles when they went through the area in 1941. That was their official story.
At the time, 4,443 bodies were found in Katyn Forest. But we now know that more than 22,000 Polish intellectuals and officers who'd been taken as prisoners of war were rounded up and shot by the Soviets before being dumped into mass graves in different locations in Western Russia. They were generals, majors, chaplains, university professors, lawyers, and engineers, targeted by Stalin and the Soviet secret police, the NKVD. It was an attempt to crush resistance to the Soviet invaders and prevent the resurgence of an independent Poland. The scale of the massacre is now undisputed, since the execution documents were made public.
After the Nazi-Soviet pact was agreed, Red Army troops move through Eastern Europe, occupying territory that was agreed as part of the secret protocol of that pact. Now, as part of that movement across Europe, Stalin wanted any pockets of potential anti-Soviet resistance to be eliminated. And this is very much in keeping with how he had operated throughout the 1930s. And this is where the Polish prisoners who were housed in Western Belarus and Western Ukraine come into this, because he saw them as potentially dangerous. They could be a rallying point for anti-Soviet opposition. Moreover, if he got rid of these prisoners, who were officers, they were Polish intellectuals, he might also head off the possibility of a resurgence of a Polish government. And of course, he was looking to install his own communist government in Poland.
In April 1943, 3 years after the killings, and almost immediately after the Red Army had recaptured the region from the Nazis, the Soviet cover-up began. The NKVD destroyed a cemetery the Germans had permitted the Polish Red Cross to build and removed other evidence. In January 1944, Moscow appointed its own investigative body, which, unsurprisingly, concluded that the Polish prisoners had been murdered in 1941 during the German occupation, not in 1940. But the cover-up extended far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. Documents released in 2012 showed how far Churchill and Roosevelt were prepared to go in accepting Stalin's denials. The Polish government in exile, based in London, was pushing for an independent inquiry into Katyn. But archives now show us that in April 1943, Churchill wrote a note to Stalin saying he would oppose vigorously any investigation. Roosevelt's language was more diplomatic, but his meaning when he wrote to Stalin was the same. I'm inclined to think that Prime Minister Churchill will find a way of prevailing upon the Polish government in London in the future to act with more common sense. We now know from American documents that were declassified in the 1970s that FDR also sent a telegram to Churchill at the end of April 1943.
Roosevelt, of course, was in a much weaker situation than Churchill because he had a large Polish-American constituency, one of the bedrock elements of the New Deal voter coalition were Polish-Americans, and they looked to Roosevelt to do something to ensure the independence of their homeland after World War II. After all, the British had gone to war in 1939 to defend Poland, but here we were in 1944, apparently getting ready to set Poland up for domination by the Soviet Union after World War II.
Churchill's ambassador to the Polish government in exile, Owen O'Malley, wrote his own report, which came to some uncomfortable conclusions. There is now available a good deal of negative evidence, the cumulative effect of which is to throw serious doubt on Russian disclaimers of responsibility for the massacre. Churchill sent the full report to Roosevelt with the following notes. I should like to have it back when you've finished with it, as we are not circulating it officially. The people who ordered and carried out this massacre were never brought to justice. But eventually, in 1990, the eighth and last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, did accept responsibility for his country's role in the tragedy.
А солидарность – это та общечеловеческая ценность, которая становится все более необходимой для прогресса и самого выживания рода людского.
We now know without a doubt that Stalin was behind these killings. But at the time, the Big Three had other, more pressing concerns, such as keeping the alliance together to defeat Hitler. Next time on Race to Victory, the Big Three meet face-to-face for the first time in Tehran. But as a result of the successes and failures of battles already fought, the dynamic of their relationship is changing.
It's very clear to Churchill that he's on the outs and that Stalin and Roosevelt are getting closer and closer. And Churchill's starting to struggle to find a place, a reason to be there.
And while the Allied forces fight their way into Italy, a second front in France is finally agreed, despite Churchill's concerns.
The Americans always believed that the war in the West would be won in France, not the Mediterranean.
To be successful in the fight against Hitler, the Big Three will need to put their differences aside once and for all. The final phase of the race to victory is beginning.